Welcome back. The Ministry of Labour, Industrial Relations and Employment Creation, in consideration of the recommendations made by the Wages Commission, has set the national minimum wage for employees at 18 Namibian dollar per hour. Its focus is to contribute to the reduction of poverty and inequality while setting a fair wage standard. We're now joined by Special Advisor to the Minister of Labour, and that is Advocate Vicki Toivo. Good evening, and thank you so much for being here.
Oh, I'm very delighted to have this opportunity. Thank you.
Welcome to the Daily Roundup. Just getting straight into it, speak to us about how this rate of 18 Namibia dollars per hour was determined, and of course what factors were considered in establishing this amount.
Well, to begin with, you should know that the minimum wage emanates from a recommendation of the Wages Commission, a tripartite, that is employer, government, and trade union commission, plus some specialists, appointed by the minister pursuant to the Labor Act. The Labor Act itself has its own criteria for what the commission must take into account. But in addition, the minister sets terms of reference. So we can only say how the $18 came about from reading the report of the commission and knowing what happened thereafter. The commission held hearings throughout the country. All right, they recommended $18 an hour. They were supposed to take into account, among other things, the cost of living, the ability of employers to pay, what the impact of a national minimum wage would be. Now, mind you, this is a minimum. This is a minimum. And you should also understand that our Constitution, the principles of state policy, mandate that workers are paid wages adequate to ensure a decent standard of living.
Right.
This $18 an hour is not enough to ensure a decent standard of living. I think you know that from your own expenses. But the commission looked at what is the situation in the country now as far as wages are concerned. It is constrained to some degree by the fact that the Namibia Statistics Agency has not conducted a labor force survey since 2018. That was pre-COVID. So one would assume that wages have not improved. The situation may have gotten worse.
Right.
But what you could see is, because Namibia is the country, the number 2 with the worst income inequality in the world, we have a small number of people in higher income brackets and a very large number of people at the bottom.
Right.
A very large number. Proposals were made. The commission in its report never explained exactly how it came up with this number, but they took into account the various submissions that were made. At the same time, after a recommendation was made to the minister, he asked the International Labour Organization to do a statistical analysis of what the impact of the minimum wage would be. Right? So that in part confirmed that the minimum wage as a starting point of $18 would be desirable. If this minimum wage, when it goes into effect, which will be on the 1st of the year, it will improve the wages potentially of more than 25% of the workforce. Those are people who are making below that amount. Obviously, there are some who make more, but it will have it potentially has a very direct impact on those who make below that amount. That's about $3,200 a month.
Right.
And in addition, it's expected that it will have some impact on the informal economy as well. There are some people who are salaried, who are in the informal economy, but the experience of other countries has shown there's what they call a lighthouse effect. If you set a wage, now employers want to keep their employees. They can't really afford to pay them less than this. So the ILO suggested that we start with this $18 an hour, recognizing that it's modest, but also recognizing that it's going to be a huge increase for a lot of workers. Employers will say it's a huge amount of money for employers to spend when they're paying their workers such low wages. The recommendation to us, by the way, the $18 was recommended a couple of years ago. So it doesn't take into account inflation. It could be higher than that.
I just need to interject there for the sake of time. I want to know about the mechanisms that are in place, that will be put in place or already in place to monitor and enforce this minimum wage of $18 per hour.
The monitoring and the enforcement is the biggest problem that we will have and that every country has when they set a minimum wage. So, one, we have a system of labor inspection, but we have a vast country and a limited complement of labor inspectors. We are trying to come up with some innovative ways to require employers to report on what they're paying. There's two things that you can do to enforce the minimum wages. You have to educate the workers who will benefit from this. If they don't know, then they won't do anything. If they know they can enforce, they have a right to a certain salary, and there are avenues where they can enforce this right, that's, to me, very important. It's also important that we educate the employers. But in addition, our ministry has asked the ILO to specifically support a project to look into enforcement, all right? Now, when I say that, we'll be the first time anyone in the world has done this. We said we want to come up with new means. We have a lot of ideas, and those ideas have to do with making it easier to pay, for example, including it in your municipal bill or various things. But at the end of the day, enforcement is the biggest problem, monitoring and enforcement. And that's why we've submitted a proposal, we've indicated it will be accepted, to look at in conjunction with the key role players, the employers and the workers, how can we best enforce it? It will not work if we rely simply on the fact that government has labor inspectors. It's critical that a lot of public education should be done. Also, we have, and we'll activate for this purpose, we have a toll-free line that will enable anybody who has questions or complaints to call directly to the labor inspectorate. So that's one thing we can do, but I can tell you, when we started investigating the domestic workers' minimum wage, which was the first statutory minimum wage that we set in Namibia, we had a lot of information about what had taken place in South Africa, and they had a lot of experience. And at that point, they had an enforcement rate of 52%, which I'm sure has increased. But we see this also as a process. We know that it's going to take time to get the wages to where we want them to be. I
also just want to raise another point before we run out of time, and I want to know if there are any exemptions specified by the minister through wage orders regarding this new minimum wage?
There are no exemptions. There's a provision in the law that employers can apply for exemptions. So far, exemptions have not been applied for. I think they may, and we can't prejudge. The minister asked the Wages Commission, are there any sectors where you would like to recommend to the minister that exemptions be granted? the Commission did not make a recommendation for exemptions. They said it should apply to everyone, and the normal statutory process should be followed. If someone, and let's say an employer, wants an exemption, they must apply and follow the provisions of the law. So that's where it's at. And the other thing that I would like to mention is in certain sectors, agriculture and domestic, the wage order provides for a phasing in over a 3-year period. Now what that means is they will receive equal increments over 3 years that will, at the end of 3 years, will bring them to the level of all other workers who are getting the minimum wage. And that was done because the wages in these sectors have historically been so low that we thought some time was needed for the employers to plan to pay the minimum wage.
Madam Toivo, I appreciate your time this evening. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Daily Roundup.
Yes, and invite us back. That's not, we've scratched the surface here.
Indeed.
Yeah,
thank you so much. Well, there you have it. When we come back, we touch on some health matters. Stay with us.